Hey everyone, it's Nabil Qureshi and David Wood once again with the unofficial Seeking Allah Finding Jesus video series. There is an official one. I would highly suggest it, especially for group study. What we're going through, a lot of it was covered in my book, Seeking Allah Finding Jesus, because these were questions that came up when I was a Muslim and challenging Christianity. They are the common objections, which is now what we're covering. We just covered a very common objection: has the Bible been corrupted? What we're going to cover now is another very common objection, which Muslims often bring up. I brought this objection up with David after we'd covered the New Testament, the reliability of the New Testament. My argument to David was, okay, fine, if the New Testament is reliable and it still says today what it used to say, I still don't see Jesus claiming to be God. Where does Jesus say, "I am God, worship me"?
And it's important to keep that wording in mind because I've talked to Muslims in Europe and in all across the United States, from New York to California, and I noticed that they were asking the same question, but in the exact same words. They kept saying, "Where did Jesus say, 'I am God, worship me'?" And I get messages daily from Muslims around the world asking the exact same thing with the exact same words. And the reason is that they've been trained to ask that specific question. This goes back to Ahmed Deedat. He put out, and there are many videos of Deedat online, as you ask your Christian friends, where does Jesus say, "I am God, worship me"? Now, you Christians who are watching, where does Jesus say, "I am God, worship me" in those words? He doesn't, right? He doesn't use those words. And that's important because as soon as you start giving a case for the deity of Christ, Muslims say, no, I want the words, "I am God, worship me," those words. And here you get down to the exact words criteria, which is absurd, because you can flip it right back on them. You can say, okay, where did Jesus say, "I'm only a prophet of Allah, don't worship me"? In those words. Those words, no other words. And the fact is, you could demand exact words for anything. Silly criterion. The reasonable criterion here is, where is Jesus claiming to be God, right? Where is he saying that kind of thing? Where is Jesus making claims that only God should make about himself? Where is he calling himself God? Something along those lines. That's a reasonable request. But since they're asking, there are lots of different ways to do this. Christians who study apologetics are usually familiar with the different ways Jesus claimed to be God. One thing I like to do is, in order to block the objection, because as soon as you explain some way Jesus is making a claim that only God should be making, they often try to reinterpret what he's saying. And so one thing I like to do is to start with the Quran, to get Muslims to see where Allah is the only one who should be saying something, and then to show ultimately that Jesus is saying the same thing about himself, just to block the reinterpretation, right? Just so they can't say, oh, well, what he really means, this is something that Allah says, he's the only one who would say it. So there are lots of examples like this. One quick one to remember, the Quran chapter 57 verse 3. So Quran chapter 57 verse 3 refers to Allah as the first and the last. These are two of Allah's 99 names. So this is a title of Allah. He is the first and the last. Nothing that comes before him, he's the first. Nothing that comes after him, he's the last. Allah is the first and the last. And this should be familiar to Christians because the Old Testament, Isaiah 44, says the same thing about Yahweh. Yahweh is the first and the last. So you can point out to your Muslim friend, hey, the Quran and the Old Testament agree that God is the first and the last. It applies that title to God. And what's interesting is that the New Testament does the exact same thing. And so I usually open to the appropriate passage and hand it to my Muslim friend and say, okay, read this for me. And so we open the Bible to Revelation chapter 1 and start at verse 17, where John has a vision. And I ask the Muslim to start reading. And the Muslim will say, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last.'" That's where I stop the Muslim and say, "Who's talking here?" And every time I've done this, the Muslim has said, "Allah," or God, right? I say, oh, why? Because we just discussed that Allah calls himself the first and the last, and according to the Bible, the first and the last is Yahweh. So here's someone saying, "I am the first and the last." And who's talking here? Oh, God. Okay, let's keep reading. "Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades." So my Muslim friend just told me this is God. When did God die? It says right there that he died. And of course, you Christians know this is Jesus talking here. So this is Jesus talking. And so by that point, I say, okay, you're asking me where to show you that Jesus called himself God. You just said he's God, my Muslim friend. I just asked you who's talking there. It was Jesus talking. I asked you who that was. You said God. So thank you for admitting that Jesus did claim to be God according to the Bible. Now, if you want to talk about the reliability of the Bible, I've already addressed that in part before. But then you can object to that. But as of right now, the Bible does say that Jesus is God.
And that's a good way to start. Again, you have to consider who's the Muslim you're talking to. What is it that they know? What approach should you take? We've talked about that in some former videos. And a lot of Muslims, just like David said, have been taught to give certain objections. And if they hear a response to an objection that's compelling, it can start them on a track towards further investigation, and they'll come to the truth. In that way, I think this is a very promising response.
This is a start, right? Here's an answer to your objection. Now, which way are you going with it? And based on where you're going with it, then, because you might say, oh, your Bible's been corrupted, or you might say that's Revelation. What about the Gospels?
Which is where I was going to go next. I think the average Muslim who's actually interested in investigating these things, and you're going to weed out a lot, by the way, just with your first level responses, all of a sudden there's going to be a bunch of people who you find out aren't actually that interested in digging for the truth. They just were looking to give you an objection. But if you find a Muslim who is interested, they're going to read this, they're going to go back, they're probably going to understand what the book of Revelation is, and they're going to say, wait a minute, this was a vision that John had. I want to hear it from Jesus' lips in the Gospels. Where does Jesus say, I am God in the Gospels? And once again, you have to say, like David said, why do we need to give those exact words? What about just seeing Jesus' deity in the Gospels? I went super deep on this issue because for me, this was the critical one. Did Jesus claim to be God or not? If he did, then Christianity is potentially true. He still needs to rise from the dead to be actually true. If he didn't claim that he is God, Christianity is not true, and Islam is potentially true. If he did claim to be God, not only is Christianity potentially true, but Islam is false. And so these are critical questions. They're not incidental, they're not peripheral, they're central to both the Christian and the Islamic worldview. And so this man Jesus, who existed in the first century, Jews and Muslims and Christians are on board with that. Did he at any point ever claim to be God? The first place most Christians go to answer this question is the book of John. Right at the beginning of the book of John is the famous prologue, En arche ein halagas, kai halagas ein prostan theon, kai theos ein halagas, right? And if you can quote Greek to a Muslim, they'll be super impressed because that's what they've been taught to do, the original language. But here's what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in fact, if you read it in the Greek, the emphasis is on God, and God was the Word. Jesus was God. That's what the message is saying right at the beginning of the Gospel of John. And everything you read through the Gospel of John needs to be read through the lens of the prologue. That's the whole point of an introduction. If you read an introduction to a book, it's saying this is how you should read the book that follows. Keep this introduction in mind as you read the rest of the book. That's exactly what John's prologue is doing. As you read what Jesus is saying and as you see what he's doing in these 21 chapters, remember, he is God. He was in the very beginning with God, and he is God, and nothing has come into existence apart from him. Everything came into existence through him. That Word, God, became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. We saw God in the flesh. No one has seen God the Father. The only one who has seen God the Father is God the Son, John 1:18, paraphrased. So that is the prologue of John's Gospel. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus is constantly doing and saying things that only God can do. He's saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Ana al-Haq. Even within Islam, I am the truth is, the word al-Haq there is another name of God, according to the 99 names of Allah in Islam. And so if Jesus calls himself the truth, he's calling himself one of the names of God. This, by the way, was enough to get Al-Hallaj, who was a Muslim, killed. When Al-Hallaj claimed to be Al-Haq, people said, look, you're claiming to be God now within the Islamic community, and so they killed him for it. Jesus said the exact same thing. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus says in John chapter 5 that you have to honor him with the same honor due to God. What prophet of Allah could ever say, honor me with the honor due to Allah? So Jesus, throughout the Gospel of John, is constantly claiming to be God. The author of the Gospel of John says he is God. The prerogatives he claims is that of God. The titles he takes are that of God. And so the Gospel of John clearly promotes Jesus as God. When David showed me this while I was still a Muslim, I then made a case against the Gospel of John. And this was based on the argumentation of one of my future professors, Bart Ehrman. I actually really embraced Ehrman's argumentation while I was a Muslim, specifically against the deity of Christ. And then when I became a Christian, I said, hey, Ehrman is one of the greatest arguers against the deity of Christ. I want to study what he has to say in the university. So when I studied at Duke University, there was a Robertson Scholar shuttle bus that would take you to UNC. So I made sure to study under Bart Ehrman while I was training as a scholar in Christian studies. And what he points out, what Bart Ehrman tries to point out, is John's gospel is the last of the four gospels. If you go to the first gospel, Mark's gospel, you have a purely human Jesus, and then he slowly elevates from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. He slowly elevates in Christology to where he becomes more and more divine. And by the time you get to John's gospel, now you have a divine Jesus. Complete hogwash. Total utter nonsense. If you study Mark's gospel the way it was intended to be read, and Ehrman never did this up until he actually wrote a book on the deity of Christ.
And then his position changed a bit.
And then his position changed tremendously. Ehrman's out here arguing for years that Jesus isn't God in Mark's gospel. Never actually took the time to study it, and I brought this up to him in class. Long story. That's another story for another day. But when he finally did publish a book on Jesus' deity, he ultimately said, I was wrong. Jesus was God in all four gospels. If you read Mark's gospel through the lens in which it was intended to be understood, and I argue that that's a Jewish lens, if you first understand the Old Testament through and through, you understand the Jewish culture of the first century, you understand the texts that Mark in his gospel is wrestling with. I actually think Mark's gospel is a testimony of Peter. Once again, another conversation for another day. But if you understand all of that, then as you read Mark's gospel, you can't conclude but that Jesus is Yahweh. Now there's a bit of a dappled picture. He's obviously Yahweh in some sense, and he's obviously human in another sense. And Mark doesn't reconcile that for us. We get the reconciliation of the two in John's gospel, but he is obviously Yahweh in Mark's gospel. Man, I don't even know how much detail to go into right here, but if you start off the very beginning of Mark's gospel, what do you have? You have the presentation of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in Mark 1:1, and then starting from Mark 1:2, you have the proclamation of John the Baptist coming, and John the Baptist is saying, make straight the paths for the Lord, prepare the way for him. If you read carefully what John the Baptist is saying in Mark chapter 1, he's combining Isaiah chapter 40 verse 3 and Malachi chapter 3. And he's combining them to say that God himself is coming to the earth. I'm the one who says, prepare the way for the coming of the Lord, for God himself who's going to come. This is exactly what John the Baptist is doing. Isaiah 40 chapter 3, Malachi chapter 3, combining them and saying, I'm saying prepare the way in the wilderness for the coming of God himself. And then who is it that comes? Jesus comes. Then you have Mark chapter 2, following right after Mark chapter 1. And in that, what does Jesus do? In the first part of Mark chapter 2, you have the pericope of a paralyzed man being lowered through the roof. Jesus does what? He forgives the man his sins, and then he heals the man of his affliction, of his physical infirmity. If you have read the Old Testament and you know the book of Psalms, Psalm 103 says that Yahweh is the one who forgives us of all our sins, who heals us of all our diseases. And yet Jesus is doing the exact same thing here, forgiving people their sins and healing them of their diseases. Only Yahweh does that in the Old Testament. Now Jesus is doing it.
And the Jewish listeners understood, right?
The Jewish listeners,
when he's claiming to forgive sins, they understood that. They objected to that, yeah.
They objected to it right there in the passage, and anyone that Mark's preaching to, again, Peter is preaching to in this Jewish context, they see it too. By the way, if you're challenging me and you're saying, Nabil, how do you know that Mark's gospel was written with the Jewish audience in mind? Because there's over 70 references. I think there's 71 references within Mark's gospel. Every single one of them is a reference to Jewish scripture. Not one of them is a reference to Greco-Roman text. Not a single one in Mark's gospel. And over half of them, by the way, are to the book of Isaiah. Anyway, so you have that in Mark chapter 2, verse 10. And then you have in Mark chapter 2, verse 28, Jesus saying that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, if you know the Old Testament, you know that the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. And Jesus is saying that he himself is Lord over one of the 10 commandments. Nobody is Lord of the 10 commandments except Yahweh himself. You go on to to Mark chapter 4, and Jesus is able to calm the storms and hush the winds. If you go to the book of Psalms, no one's able to hush the storms and calm the winds except Yahweh. You go to Mark chapter 6, verse 50, Jesus is walking on the water and he says the words, Ego eimi, I am. In the Old Testament, Yahweh, God, is the one who says, I am. Read Job chapter 9, verse 8. Only Yahweh is the one who has the authority to walk on water, and yet Jesus is the one who does that in the New Testament. I don't have time to go into this, but over and over and over again, Mark's gospel pulls out Yahweh from the Old Testament and inserts Jesus. You're literally one-for-one substitution on Jesus where Yahweh was in the Old Testament. This is the first of the 4 gospels. Ehrman's argument holds no water whatsoever. But this is even more true because before Mark's gospel was written, at least according to scholarly consensus, Paul's writings were written. And Paul clearly says that Jesus is God. All you have to do is read Philippians chapter 2, and Jesus is in very nature God. Chapter 2, verse 6. But he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. Did I say Ephesians? I meant Philippians.
I thought you said Philippians.
I said Philippians. He's in very nature God, but he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, and so he emptied himself, taking the form of man, and being found in human likeness, he humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. What's Paul saying? That God himself lowered himself into this world and was found in human likeness. When we're talking about Jesus, the emphasis is on this is in very nature God found in human likeness, almost focusing more on the divine essence of Christ than on the human essence of Christ. Of course, Christians believe that Jesus has a fully human nature and a fully divine nature. So this is found, according to scholarly consensus, at every level. If it's found in Paul, and it's found in the Gospels, it's found in the book of Revelation, it's found everywhere. The deity of Christ is found everywhere. There's no evolution in Jesus' deity. He was divine from the very earliest texts. There's a lot more to go into. There's a lot more covered in this book on the deity of Christ. This is an essential issue for both Christians and Muslims, and so I highly suggest you look into it. Don't let the rhetoric of where does Jesus say I am God, worship me, deter you from actually investigating the truth of this question, because it's the question that changed my life. And if you're a Muslim and you honestly think Jesus didn't claim to be God, I'm telling you, dig and you will be shocked. It changed my life forever. That's where I like to take people on the deity of Christ. Not just John's Gospel, not just the book of Revelation, everywhere throughout the New Testament. It's the common proclamation that shocked the world. It's what made people say, wow, God has come among us. God has walked with it. Did you see what happened here? God came to us. Who are we that God would come to us? How amazing is this God that he would bear our burdens? And that's the crux of the gospel message. God walked among us. Amazing, amazing. So look at it. Don't be deterred by pithy objections that actually hold no water. Do you have anything else to add to this one? All right, great. So the next objection we're going to come to will be in the next video. Again, we're covering the 5 most common objections by Muslims to the Christian faith. Thanks so much for watching this one. We'll see you again shortly.